Do you want to unlock your brain's superpower? Well, then you may want to understand how your brain works a little bit more. Have you ever wondered why sometimes you remember things perfectly and other times you struggle to recall even the simplest details? What if I told you that your ability to remember is not just about how hard you try, but also about the state of your mind and body when you learn that information in the first place? Welcome to state-dependent learning, a phenomenon where your mental and physical state at the time of learning can lock away your memories, only to be unlocked when you return to that same state. Let me make an example. Have you ever had an experience where you're angry about something and then all these other memories of like when you were angry at other times start coming up? Or like, let's say you're happy about something, you're in a good mood, and then you start having like happy memories come up. Same thing with sad. That's a little bit deeper, but I'm going to go through 4 studies here and let's just dive it right into this. So this concept is probably going to fuck up your brain just like it did mine, especially as I was researching it by exploring some studies where they harass mice, play Bach music to people. So how did this fuck up my brain as I was researching this? Well, if you start researching something about how you learn or like your ability to recall information and the entire way that you're processing things while you're actually doing that task, you start to think a little bit too deeply, like, oh, I need to optimize my state, blah, etc. And so for example, I was listening to a song called Hi Hi by Luna. It is the Swelsvelt remix. It's this song. Here's a quick clip of it so you just know how insane I am. While I was writing and researching this, and when the song stopped, I kept losing my train of thought. I had to keep replaying it. Also, I really liked the visuals in that song. And at the time of writing this sentence right now, I am dependent on looping this song over and over again for generating this little script here. There's also influence at the time of day influences our ability to recall information and do work. I'd argue that the place you're even in, the people you're around, your level of hydration, everything. So let's look at our first study. Our first journey into state-dependent learning involves harassing mice and takes us into the world of caffeine, a substance that, well, everyone in the world relies on to kickstart our mornings and keep us alert throughout the day. But caffeine's effects on our minds are not as straightforward as they seem. In a study done by S.D.L and other authors, 2013, researchers decided to test how caffeine, specifically at a high dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram, let's see, if I weigh like 80 kilograms, so about 1600 milligrams of caffeine. It's like 16 espressos. Affects memory in mice. The experiment involved administering caffeine to the mice before they were trained in 2 tasks: the plus maze discriminative avoidance task and the inhibitory avoidance task. I don't exactly know what those are, but these tasks are designed to evaluate not just learning and memory, but also anxiety-like behavior and general activity. Interesting to note, in the group of mice that they overdosed on caffeine, the mice, they wrote in the study that the mice produced an anxious-like effect. Anyways, what they found was intriguing. When caffeine was given before the training phase, it didn't alter the mice's ability to learn tasks. However, it did induce anxiety, which in turn impaired their ability to retain information they had learned. But here's where it gets interesting. When caffeine was administered again before the testing phase, so they're training the mice to do something on caffeine, and then they're testing them on that same thing with the same amount of caffeine, it counteracted the memory deficit that had been induced by overdosing them on caffeine originally. In essence, the mice could remember what they had learned only when they were in the same caffeinated, extremely anxious state. And this study really underscores the power of state-dependent learning. The anxious state induced by caffeine created a unique memory context that could only be accessed when the same state was replicated. It suggests that the memories we form under the influence of certain substances, and there's a lot of substances, or in particular emotional states, might be locked away, accessible only when we return to that state. Let's look at another study, this time when they're not harassing mice by overdosing them on caffeine. Something a bit more pleasant: music and humans. Music has the power to move us. I mean, I was just showing you my addiction to, I think it's called breakcore. I don't know. It was K-pop music with drum and bass beats. Music has the power to change our mood and, as it turns out, to influence our ability to remember. In a study done by Ake and other authors from 1989, researchers explored how music-induced mood affects state-dependent learning in humans. The study involved 48 undergraduate students who were placed into either a happy or sad mood using carefully selected pieces of classical music. The happy tunes were, this is in German, Mozart's Ein klein Nachtmusik, while the sad selections featured Barber's Adagio for string, and not the Tiesto remix. The participants were asked to learn a series of words while the music played, effectively locking their memories into the emotional state induced by the music. 2 days later, they were tested on their recall, either with the same music playing to recreate the original mood, or with different music to change their state. And the results were striking. Participants recalled significantly more words when their mood during the recall phase matched their mood during the learning phase. The recall phase is when they tested them, but the effect was even stronger for words they had generated themselves rather than words they simply read. This suggests that our most personal, self-generated memories are the most susceptible to the influences of our emotional state. Now, back to the next study where they unfortunately harass mice again. I like the mice studies, but the stuff they do to these guys. Let's go. Our journey through the mysterious world of state-dependent learning wouldn't be complete without revisiting the mice, but this time with a different twist. In another experiment, researchers explored how an emotional significant stimulus, like a tone paired with a foot shock, could disrupt the state-dependent learning induced by a drug. In this case, Librium, a benzodiazepine, which is similar to like Xanax, Valium, clonazepam. I've never heard of Librium, but it's a benzo. In this study, mice were divided into several groups, with some receiving the Librium and others just sterile water. The researchers trained the mice to avoid a foot shock by turning in a specific direction in a T-maze. So like it's a little maze, you can go left or right, with a tone played alongside the shock to create an emotional association. So they play a tone, and then if there's a tone, it's like a cue that they're about to get like shocked. If they go to a certain, if they go one of the directions in the T-maze. When it came time to test their memory, some of the mice were given the Librium again, we can just call it Xanax, while others were not, and the tone was either played or omitted. What researchers found was that the mice only performed well when they were in the same drug-induced state as during training. Another example of state-dependent learning. But when the tone was played during the test, it disrupted the state-dependent effect. The emotional significance of the tone acted as a powerful trigger, allowing the mice to recall the learned behavior even when their physiological state had changed. So it looks like they did a test where they didn't give them benzodiazepines, and one where they did give them benzodiazepines to look at the effects of state-dependent learning. And then they did the same thing. They gave them the benzodiazepines again, but this time they played a tone to see if they could disrupt the state-dependent effect via an emotional cue, like beep, chuck. The emotional significance of the tone acted as a powerful trigger, actually allowing the mice to recall the learned behavior even when their physiological state had changed. This study reveals how deeply our emotions are intertwined with our memories, and sometimes a strong emotional cue is all it takes to bypass the barriers of state-dependent learning, unlocking memories that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Finally, or second to last, let's look at a study that takes state-dependent learning out of the lab and into the gym. In 1998, researchers Christopher Miles and Eleanor Hardman wanted to see if the physiological changes induced by aerobic exercise could also create a state-dependent effect on memory. They recruited 24 undergraduate students and had them learn a list of trisyllabic, words with 3 syllables, under 2 conditions, one while resting and one while exercising on a stationary bike with their heart rates elevated to between 120 to 150 beats per minute. 2 days later, the students were tested on their recall of the words, either in the same state or in a different one, and the findings were clear. Participants remembered significantly more words when their state during recall matched their state during learning. If they learned the words while exercising, they could recall them better while exercising again. But if they switched states, learning while resting and learning and recalling while exercising, or vice versa, their memory performance suffered. This study extends the concept of state-dependent learning beyond drugs and emotions, and to include natural physiological changes. Another thing in this study that was interesting was that this was actually this effect was even more pronounced when the subjects were close to the actual heart rate that they had learned the words in. All right, and finally, your location and state-dependent learning. This last study investigated the phenomenon of context-dependent memory, specifically examining whether recall is better when the environmental context during learning and retrieval matches. Divers learned lists of words either on land or underwater and were later tested for recall in either the same or different environment. The results showed a significant context dependency effect, with superior recall observed when the learning and recall environments matched. So 18 participants, members of a diving club, there was 36 unrelated words of 2 or 3 syllables. Participants learned a list of words either on land or 20 feet underwater. After a 4-minute delay filled with an unrelated task, they were tested for recall in the same or different environment. And the results were simply a significant interaction was found between learning and recall environments. Recall was significantly better when the learning and recall environments on land, underwater, compared to when they mismatched on land and then underwater, or underwater on land. And there are actually some metrics that they have for this. I'm not exactly sure what these, just take them for sort of like a ratio. But the matching conditions, they learned something on land and they were asked to recall it on land, their score was 13.5. If they learned it underwater and were asked to recall it underwater, their score was 11.4. Now, if there was a mismatch in conditions, they learned it on land and then they had to recall them underwater, it was only about an 8.5. Same thing if they learned it underwater and then they were asked to recall it on land. So, in short, state-dependent learning is a phenomenon tied to living, and understanding it, but not being a prisoner to it, is a useful tool to be able to a superhuman.